They thought she didn't belong there. But within minutes, the entire room would realize they were standing in her world. Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd really appreciate your support. Take a quick moment to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. It's completely free and helps us keep bringing you more powerful and emotional content. Also, I'd love to know where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thanks so much for being here. The Blackwood estate stretched across nearly 50 acres of manicured lawns and sculpted hedges, its towering limestone facade glowing under golden evening lights, and inside, beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's homes, the annual winter gala was already in full swing. Laughter echoing softly against polished marble floors as guests in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns moved gracefully from one conversation to another, each step measured, each smile calculated, each presence carefully curated, because this was not just a party, it was a display of status, of lineage, of belonging, and everyone there understood the unspoken rule that if you had to question whether you belonged, you probably didn't. And that was exactly why the moment Clara Whitmore stepped through the grand entrance alone, the energy in the room shifted ever so slightly, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a ripple across still water. Her dress was simple, a soft ivory fabric that fell cleanly to her ankles, no glitter, no embellishment, no attempt to compete with the opulence surrounding her, her shoes modest, her hair pulled back neatly, and for a brief second, no one said anything. But eyes noticed, they always did, a glance here, a whisper there, until the ripple became a quiet current of curiosity mixed with judgment, because in a room where every detail screamed wealth and power, simplicity didn't read as elegance, it read as absence, and absence was suspicious. A woman near the champagne tower leaned toward her companion, her voice barely above a whisper. Did she come alone? And the response came with a faint smirk. Looks like it. And just like that, the narrative was written before Clara had taken more than 10 steps inside. A man in a midnight blue tuxedo adjusted his cufflinks as he watched her approach, his eyes narrowing. Slightly, not with anger, but with amusement, the kind reserved for unexpected entertainment. And as Clara moved further into the ballroom, her gaze steady, unhurried, taking in the towering columns, the sweeping staircase, the oil portraits lining the walls as though she were reacquainting herself with something familiar rather than discovering it for the first time, the man stepped directly into her path, his polished shoes stopping just inches from hers. "Excuse me," he said, his tone smooth, but edged with condescension, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I think you might be in the wrong place." A soft chuckle followed from somewhere behind him, and another voice added, "Staff and trances around back." The laughter wasn't explosive, it didn't need to be, it was controlled, refined, the kind that carried more weight because it pretended to be polite. And through it all, Clara didn't flinch, didn't rush to explain herself, didn't shrink under the attention, her eyes lifted, slightly, meeting his gaze with a calm that felt almost out of place in a moment designed to unsettle, and for a fraction of a second, something in that stillness caused the man's smile to falter, just slightly, but not enough for him to reconsider, because people like him rarely question their first judgment. Not here, not in a room like this, not when everything around them had always reinforced that they were right. The man's smirk lingered, encouraged by the quiet laughter surrounding them, as if the room itself had already decided who Clara Whitmore was and where she belonged. And in places like this, those judgments rarely needed confirmation. They simply became truth through repetition. A woman in a silver gown lifted her champagne glass and tilted her head, studying Clara with thinly veiled curiosity. "You really should have checked the invitation list," she said, her tone light but cutting. "This event is private." And a few nearby guests nodded subtly, their expressions polished but dismissive, reinforcing the invisible barrier that had already formed around Clara. Yet she remained exactly where she stood, her posture straight, her hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes moving once more across the room, not searching for approval, not seeking permission, but observing, almost as if she were measuring something only she understood, and that quiet composure unsettled more than it impressed. Because confidence without visible status felt like a disruption. A break in the carefully maintained order of things. The man in the tuxedo exhaled softly, his patience thinning. "Look," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled. "Whoever invited you made a mistake, and I would suggest you leave before this becomes embarrassing." The word embarrassing hung in the air like a warning, not just for Clara, but for anyone who might dare to challenge the assumption behind it. And still, she did not move. Instead, she turned her gaze slightly past him, toward the sweeping staircase that curved elegantly to the upper level, her expression unchanged, almost thoughtful, as though the conversation in front of her was a minor interruption rather than the defining moment everyone else believed it to be. A server passing by slowed just slightly, his eyes flickering toward Clara with a brief, almost imperceptible nod before continuing on, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. The woman in silver frowned faintly, sensing something she could not quite place, but dismissing it just as quickly, because doubt had no place in a room built on certainty. "Security can assist you if needed," she added, her smile tightening, and now more eyes turned openly, conversations pausing, the soft music from the string quartet continuing in the background, as if unaware of the tension building beneath it. This was the moment they all recognized, the quiet peak before someone was either accepted or removed, and they leaned into it, drawn by the familiar pattern. But Clara's gaze finally returned to the man in front of her, steady, unwavering, and for a second, the room seemed to hold its breath, because there was something in her expression that did not match the narrative they had written for her, something that did not ask for approval or fear rejection, something that simply existed without explanation, and that was far more unsettling than defiance. The man shifted slightly, just enough to betray a flicker of discomfort he did not fully understand, yet pride held him in place. "This is your last chance," he said, more firmly now, as if volume could restore his certainty, and around them, the silence deepened, not empty, but charged, filled with expectation, with judgment, with the quiet thrill of witnessing a line about to be crossed. And still, Clara did not step back, did not apologize, did not explain. She simply stood there, as though the room, the chandeliers, the portraits, the very walls themselves were not foreign to her at all, but intimately known. And somewhere beneath the surface of that polished crowd, something began to shift, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in a perfectly smooth facade. And though no one could yet name it, they could feel it, the sense that perhaps, just perhaps, they had misread the moment entirely. And the room went just a little quieter. The silence stretched just long enough to make people uncomfortable, not the kind of silence that fades naturally, but the kind that presses against the chest, forcing attention, forcing doubt. And in that suspended moment, Clara Whitmore finally moved, not backward as they expected, not with hesitation or apology, but with a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the small distance between herself and the man who had tried to block her path, her presence calm, unhurried, as if time itself adjusted to her pace. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, steady, carrying just enough to reach those closest, yet somehow cutting through the room more effectively than any raised tone could. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," she said. And it was not a challenge, not a plea, not even a defense. It was a statement, simple and absolute. And that was what unsettled them most. Because certainty like that did not belong to someone in her position, not according to everything they believed. The man let out a short laugh, sharper now, less polished, as though he needed to reclaim control of the narrative slipping through his fingers. "You do not even know what this event is," he replied, his voice lifting just enough to draw more attention. "This is the Blackwood Winter Gala, invitation only, attended by families who have been part of this estate for generations." And there it was, the word that mattered most. Generations, a subtle reminder that this was not just about wealth, but history, about names that carried weight long before anyone in the room had been born. And the implication was clear: Clara did not belong to that history. She could not dressed like that, not standing there alone. And yet, if his intention was to intimidate, it failed to land the way he expected, because Clara's expression did not change, not even slightly. Instead, her eyes lifted past him once more, this time settling on one of the large oil portraits mounted high along the wall. a figure painted with careful detail, an older man standing beside the very staircase that curved behind them, his posture commanding, his presence unmistakable even in stillness. And for a brief second, something almost like recognition flickered across Clara's face, so subtle that most would have missed it. But the woman in silver noticed, her brow tightening just slightly. "You should not be looking up there," she said quickly, stepping closer, her voice lower now, more controlled. "Those portraits are not for visitors." The pause before the last word was intentional, carefully chosen, and it landed exactly as she intended, drawing a quiet line between those who belonged and those who merely passed through. But Clara did not look away, her gaze lingering for just a moment longer before returning to the present. And when she did, there was a faint shift in her expression, not defiance, not anger, but something deeper, something that suggested memory rather than curiosity. And that was when the hostess approached again, her smile fixed, professional, but now edged with urgency, because the situation had lingered longer than it should have. And in a place like this, prolonged attention was dangerous. It invited questions, and questions threatened order. "Ma'am," the hostess said, her tone firm but polite, "I am going to have to insist that you step outside with me." And now there was no pretense, no suggestion, only expectation, and the room leaned in once more, waiting for the inevitable conclusion, waiting for Clara to finally comply, to confirm everything they had already decided about her. But instead, she turned her head slightly, just enough to glance toward the grand entrance behind them, her eyes narrowing the slightest bit, as if she had heard something no one else had yet noticed. And for a fraction of a second, the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the first sign of a storm rolling in before the sky has changed. And though no one could explain it, the room grew still, instinctively, as if something was about to happen, something that would rewrite everything they thought they understood. And without realizing why, several guests turned toward the doors at the exact same moment. The doors did not burst open. They did not need to. They moved. Slowly, deliberately, as if the building itself understood the weight of the moment. The soft creak of polished wood cutting through the silence like a signal, and instantly, the subtle hum of conversation that had lingered at the edges of the room vanished completely. Every head turning in perfect unison, drawn not by sound alone, but by something deeper, something instinctive. The kind of presence that announces itself before a single word is spoken. And then he stepped inside, Duke Alexander Blackwood, his posture upright, his pace measured, his dark tailored suit catching the warm glow of the chandeliers as he crossed the threshold. And it was not just his title that commanded attention. It was the way the room responded to him. The immediate straightening of shoulders, the quiet lowering of voices, the way even those who had been speaking moments ago now fell completely still, as though anything less than silence would be disrespectful. And as he moved forward, his footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor, steady, unhurried, each one reinforcing the shift that had just taken place. This was no longer a room of whispers and quiet judgments. This was now his domain, and everyone present knew it. The man who had blocked Clara's path turned slightly, his expression shifting instantly from amusement to something far more cautious, his spine straightening, his smile tightening into something more formal. Practiced, because in front of power, confidence often reshaped itself into obedience. The woman in silver adjusted her posture as well, lifting her chin just a fraction, as though proximity alone might grant her recognition. But the Duke did not acknowledge any of them, not yet, his gaze moving calmly across the room, not searching, but observing, taking in the arrangement of guests, the spacing, the subtle tension that lingered like a quiet current beneath the polished surface. And then, without warning, his eyes stopped, not on the man who had spoken, not on the hostess, not on the cluster of well-dressed guests who now watched him expectantly, but on Clara Whitmore. And for a brief moment, time seemed to hesitate, as though even the air needed to catch up with what was happening, because the look on his face was not confusion, not curiosity, but recognition, clear and immediate, and something else, something that did not belong to the dynamic of this room at all. Respect. And it was that single detail that began to unravel everything. The man in the tuxedo noticed it first, the slight change in the Duke's expression, the way his focus did not shift, the way he did not continue forward as expected, and a flicker of uncertainty passed through him, subtle but undeniable. Because this was not how these moments usually unfolded, the Duke was supposed to greet guests, to circulate, to maintain the rhythm of the evening, not to pause at the edge of a quiet confrontation. And yet, that was exactly what he was doing. And then, with the same calm precision that defined every movement he made, the Duke took a step forward, not toward the center of the room, but directly toward Clara, the distance between them closing slowly, deliberately, and with each step, the tension tightened, guests exchanging brief glances, unspoken questions passing between them, because something was happening, something none of them had anticipated. And as he approached, the man who had blocked Clara's path instinctively stepped aside, not out of courtesy, but out of something closer to instinct, the kind that surfaces when certainty begins to crack. And now, there was nothing between Clara and the Duke, no barrier, no interruption, just a line of sight that held the entire room in place. And when he finally stopped in front of her, the silence deepened even further, if that was possible. Every eye fixed on the two of them, waiting, measuring, trying to understand, and then the Duke inclined his head slightly, not a bow, not a grand gesture, but a movement so subtle it might have been missed, if not for what it meant. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying effortlessly across the room without the need for volume. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and in that single moment, the room did not just go silent, it shifted completely, because he had not asked who she was. He had not questioned her presence. He had acknowledged it, and more than that, he had recognized it. And the man who had laughed earlier felt something cold settle in his chest, not fear exactly, but the unmistakable realization that the story he thought he understood was no longer his to control. The name lingered in the air like a quiet verdict, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire room needed time to recalibrate around what had just been said, because in a place where introductions defined hierarchy, the way a name was spoken mattered, and Duke Alexander Blackwood had not simply recognized Clara Whitmore. He had addressed her with a familiarity that did not belong to an outsider. The man in the tuxedo felt his throat tighten slightly, his earlier confidence now shifting into something far less certain, his mind searching for an explanation that would restore the order he had relied on just minutes before. But none came, because nothing about this moment followed the rules he understood. The woman in silver lowered her glass just a fraction, her eyes narrowing as she studied Clara more carefully now, not as a curiosity, but as a question, one that demanded an answer she did not yet have. And Clara, through it all, remained exactly as she had been, composed, steady, her gaze meeting the Duke's without hesitation, without surprise, as if this recognition was neither unexpected nor overdue, but simply inevitable. And when she responded, her voice was quiet, measured. "Your Grace," she said, the title spoken with ease, not as flattery, not as performance, but as something practiced, something familiar. And that, more than anything else, sent a ripple through the crowd, because titles like that were not used lightly, not spoken so naturally unless they belonged in one's world. The Duke's expression softened, just slightly, a shift so subtle it might have been missed if the entire room had not been watching him so closely. And then he did something that no one had anticipated. He stepped half a pace closer and extended his hand, not as a formality, not as a distant courtesy, but as a gesture of genuine acknowledgement. And after the briefest pause, Clara placed her hand in his, the movement simple, unhurried, yet carrying a weight that pressed against every assumption in the room, because this was not how one greeted a stranger. This was not how one treated someone who did not belong. And the silence that followed was no longer just tension, it was realization beginning to form, slow but undeniable. The man in the tuxedo felt heat rise along the back of his neck, a discomfort he could not disguise, because every second that passed without correction made his earlier words feel heavier, sharper, more visible. And for the first time that evening, he wished the moment would move on, wished the Duke would shift his attention elsewhere, restore the familiar rhythm of polite conversation and measured interactions. But the Duke did not look away. His focus remained entirely on Clara, and when he spoke again, His voice carried just enough to reach beyond them, not loud, but intentional. "I was beginning to wonder if you would attend this year," he said, and the implication landed instantly. Not only had Clara been here before, not only was her presence expected, it had been anticipated, and that single detail fractured the last remaining thread of doubt, because this was no accident, no misunderstanding, no misplaced invitation. This was someone who belonged in a way deeper than appearance could reveal. The woman in silver inhaled sharply, her composure slipping for just a moment before she quickly masked it behind a practiced smile. But the damage was already done. The narrative had shifted, and there was no returning to the version they had constructed earlier. And then, almost as if sensing the weight of what had just unfolded, the Duke turned his gaze slightly, not away from Clara, but just enough to include the surrounding guests, his expression calm, controlled, yet carrying a quiet authority that needed no reinforcement. And in that moment, the room understood something without it being said, that whatever they had assumed, whatever they had whispered, whatever judgments they had made, they had been wrong, and the realization settled over them like a slow, heavy silence, the kind that does not demand attention, but commands it nonetheless. The weight of the Duke's words did not fade. It deepened, settling into every corner of the ballroom like a truth that could not be undone. And for the first time that evening, the silence was no longer filled with judgment, but with something far more uncomfortable, realization. The man in the tuxedo shifted his stance again, this time not out of confidence, but out of uncertainty, his earlier smirk now completely gone, replaced by a tight expression that struggled to maintain composure. Because everything he had said, every assumption he had made, now stood exposed in the most public way possible, and in a room where reputation mattered more than almost anything else, that kind of exposure was not easily dismissed. The woman in silver lowered her gaze briefly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass, as if grounding herself in something familiar, something stable. But even she could not ignore the shift, because Clara Whitmore was no longer the outsider they had defined her as. She was something else entirely, something that did not fit into the neat categories they relied on, and that unsettled them in ways they could not immediately articulate. Clara, however, remained unchanged, her posture still, her expression calm, as though the transformation happening around her did not surprise her at all, as though she had seen it before, perhaps many times. The Duke released her hand gently, but did not step away. Instead, he turned slightly, angling his body just enough to face the room more directly, his presence expanding to fill the space without effort. And when he spoke again, his voice carried with quiet clarity, not raised, not forced, but impossible to ignore. "For those of you who may not recognize her," he began, pausing just long enough for the words to settle, for the attention to sharpen, for every eye in the room to focus completely. "Miss Whitmore has been part of this estate far longer than most of us." And the sentence landed with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. A ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable, because this was not simply recognition. This was history. This was belonging at a level that could not be imitated or purchased. The man in the tuxedo felt his chest tighten, his mind racing to reconcile the image of the woman he had dismissed with the identity now being revealed. But the pieces did not fit, not yet, and that gap between perception and truth only made the moment heavier. The Duke's gaze moved briefly across the faces before him, not lingering, not accusing, but aware, and that awareness carried its own weight. Because he did not need to call anyone out directly, the room already understood. And then he continued, his tone unchanged, steady, measured. "Her family's contributions are woven into the foundation of this place," he said, and as he spoke, his eyes flicked briefly toward the portraits lining the walls, drawing a connection that now felt obvious, almost undeniable. And suddenly, the way Clara had looked at those paintings earlier, the way she had carried herself, the way she had not reacted to the pressure around her, all of it began to make sense. Not as coincidence, but as context, as truth that had been present all along, simply ignored by those too focused on appearances to see it. The woman in silver inhaled slowly, her earlier certainty dissolving into something quieter, something more cautious, because in a single moment, the hierarchy she had relied on had shifted, and she was no longer sure where she stood within it. And the man in the tuxedo, who had once blocked Clara's path with effortless confidence, now found himself stepping back slightly, not commanded to, not instructed, but compelled by something deeper, the recognition that he had misjudged not just a person, but a position, a history, a place that he himself did not fully understand. And as that realization settled over the room, the atmosphere changed completely. The tension that had once been sharp and pointed now softened into a quiet, heavy stillness, the kind that follows when truth replaces assumption. And in that stillness, Clara Whitmore stood exactly as she had from the beginning, unchanged, unmoved, her dignity never lost, never shaken, and now, finally, fully seen. The silence that followed did not break. It deepened, stretching across the ballroom like a quiet reckoning that no one could escape. Because now the truth was no longer implied. It had been spoken, and once spoken, it could not be taken back. The man in the tuxedo felt his pulse quicken slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness of how visible he had become. How every word he had spoken earlier now echoed differently in the minds of those around him, stripped of confidence, stripped of certainty, reduced to something far less admirable. And though no one openly stared, he could feel it. The subtle shift in how others perceived him, the unspoken recalculation of his place in the room. The woman in silver adjusted her posture once more, but this time it was not to present confidence. It was to regain it. Her earlier composure fractured just enough to reveal the effort behind it. Because in a world built on appearances, losing control of the narrative, even briefly, was a risk no one could afford. And yet, the narrative had already changed, completely, and there was no reclaiming it. Clara Whitmore, who had stood at the center of it all without reacting, without defending herself, now became the quiet axis around which the room reoriented itself, not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer needed to. The Duke allowed the weight of his words to settle before speaking again, his gaze moving slowly across the crowd, not searching for reactions, but acknowledging them, understanding them. And in that understanding was a subtle but unmistakable message, one that did not need to be spoken aloud. That respect was not granted by appearance, nor withdrawn by assumption. It was revealed through truth. And then, with a calm that carried more authority than any raised voice ever could, he continued. "Some of you may recall the Whitmore name from the original estate records," he said. And now there was no mistaking it. This was not merely a connection. This was lineage, history, something rooted far deeper than the polished surface of the evening. A quiet murmur passed through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but present, as recognition began to take hold. Names remembered, stories recalled, details that had once seemed distant now pulling themselves into focus. The portraits along the walls, the architecture of the estate, the very foundation of the place they stood in, all of it suddenly connected by a thread that led directly to the woman they had dismissed just moments ago. And as that realization settled in, it carried with it a weight that no apology could immediately lift. The man in the tuxedo lowered his gaze briefly, not out of submission, but out of the instinct to retreat, to become less visible in a moment that had turned against him. Yet there was no real escape, because the lesson unfolding in front of him was not directed at him alone. It was shared, collective, and unavoidable. The Duke turned his attention back to Clara, his expression composed, but now carrying a hint of something warmer, something closer to familiarity. "Your grandfather would have appreciated seeing you here tonight," he said. And for the first time, Clara's expression shifted, just slightly, a softness passing through her eyes, not dramatic, not overt, but enough to reveal that this moment held more than just social correction. It held memory, connection, something personal that extended beyond the room. And in that brief change, the distance between her and the Duke was no longer defined by title or status, but by shared understanding, by history that neither needed to explain. And around them, the room remained still, not frozen, but attentive in a different way now, no longer waiting for someone to be removed, but witnessing something being restored, dignity that had never truly been lost, only overlooked. And in that stillness, the earlier laughter, the quiet remarks, the subtle judgments all seemed smaller, diminished by the clarity that had replaced them. Because now, everyone could see what had been there from the beginning, and the only thing that had changed was their perception. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was complete, and yet no one spoke, because there are moments when words only diminish what is already understood, and this was one of them. The kind of silence that does not come from emptiness but from clarity, from the quiet recognition that something important has just been revealed, and that it cannot be undone. The man in the tuxedo remained where he stood, but his presence had changed, the confidence that once anchored him now replaced by a careful stillness, as though any movement might draw attention he could no longer control, his earlier words echoing in his mind with a sharpness that grew with every passing second, not because anyone repeated them, but because now he understood exactly how they must have sounded, and more importantly, who had heard them. The woman in silver took a slow breath, her posture steady but her eyes no longer dismissive. Instead, they studied Clara with a different kind of focus, one shaped not by curiosity, but by reassessment, because in a single moment, everything she thought she understood about presence, about belonging, about what defined a person's place in a room like this, had been quietly dismantled, and there was no script for that, no graceful way to recover from a misjudgment so public, so complete. Clara Whitmore, however, did not look at either of them, did not acknowledge the shift in their expressions, because she did not need to. Her attention remained with the Duke, her posture unchanged, her composure intact, as if the correction that had just taken place was not a victory, not a moment to be claimed, but simply a return to balance, something that should never have been disrupted in the first place. And that quiet restraint carried more weight than any display of triumph ever could. The Duke allowed a brief pause to settle before speaking again, his voice calm, measured, but now carrying a note that extended beyond explanation, something closer to intention. This estate stands today because of decisions made long before any of us were invited into rooms like this, he said, his gaze moving slowly across the guests, not accusing, not singling anyone out, but including everyone in what he was about to say. And some of those decisions were made by people who did not care to be seen. And as the words settled, they carried a quiet implication, one that reached beyond Clara, beyond the moment, into something broader, something that challenged the very assumptions the room had been built upon, because visibility, status, presentation, all the things they had relied on to define worth, suddenly felt incomplete, even shallow, when placed against the idea of contribution, of legacy, of impact that did not announce itself. The Duke turned slightly back toward Clara, his expression softening once more. Your family understood that better than most, he said, and this time, there was no need for further explanation. The connection had already been made, the story already unfolding in the minds of those who had just begun to see it clearly, and for a brief moment, something almost like regret passed through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but present, a collective awareness of how quickly judgment had formed, how easily it had been accepted, and how wrong it had been. The man in the tuxedo opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, to correct, to offer something that might restore his place, but no words came, because there are moments when language fails, when the weight of understanding is too immediate, too complete to be softened by explanation, and so he remained silent, as did the others around him, because the room no longer belonged to their voices. It belonged to the truth that had just been revealed, and in that truth, Clara Whitmore stood not elevated, not transformed, but simply recognized, exactly as she had been from the moment she walked through the doors, unchanged, unshaken, and finally, undeniable. No one rushed to fill the silence, because something more powerful than conversation had taken hold, the kind of stillness that forces reflection whether you want it or not. And in that moment, the grand ballroom of the Blackwood estate no longer felt like a stage for status, but a mirror, quietly revealing the difference between appearance and truth. The man in the tuxedo finally lowered his gaze, not dramatically, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that settles slowly and leaves no room for denial. His earlier confidence now replaced by something quieter, something more honest, and though he did not speak, the absence of his voice said more than any apology could. The woman in silver shifted her weight slightly, her expression softened, the sharpness gone, replaced by a measured composure that carried a hint of humility she had not needed before, because in a single evening, the rules she had relied on had been rewritten without warning, and there was no undoing that. Clara Whitmore stood exactly where she had from the beginning, her presence unchanged, her dignity intact, not elevated by what had been revealed, but simply aligned with it, as if the entire moment had been less about transformation and more about correction. The Duke glanced at her once more, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them, not needing explanation, not needing words, and then, with the same calm authority he had carried since entering the room, he turned slightly, allowing the evening to resume, not abruptly, not artificially, but naturally. As though the lesson had been given and understood, the soft music from the string quartet returned to awareness. Conversations began again, quieter at first, more thoughtful, less certain, and as guests moved, their steps carried a different weight now, not lighter, but more aware, because something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of what they once believed defined importance. The man in the tuxedo stepped aside fully, no longer blocking Clara's path, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. And as she moved past him, there was no hesitation in her step, no glance back, no need to revisit what had already been resolved, because dignity, once recognized, does not demand acknowledgement, it simply exists. The woman in silver watched her pass, her earlier assumptions replaced by a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken aloud, because some lessons are not meant to be declared, they are meant to be carried forward. And as Clara ascended the sweeping staircase, her figure framed by the warm glow of the chandeliers above, the portraits along the walls seemed to take on new meaning, no longer distant symbols of history, but reflections of a legacy that still lived, still moved, still stood quietly among them. And in that moment, the Blackwood estate did not feel larger, it felt deeper, layered with stories that could not be measured by appearance alone, and for those who had witnessed it, the evening would not be remembered for its elegance or its grandeur, but for the quiet reminder that presence is not always announced, that worth is not always visible, and that sometimes the person you overlook is the very one who defines the room you stand in. And as the night continued, that understanding lingered, subtle but permanent, woven into every glance, every conversation, every unspoken thought that followed, because respect, once revealed, cannot be unseen, and that night, the room remembered what it means to truly see. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, don't forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.